All right. Hello, everyone. We are live with our Agile Genesis podcast. We're coming with Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Soon we will have X added as well with our live programming. And today we got a very special segment where we have Dave Witkins. Dave, welcome. How are you, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Ernesto.
All right. So Dave and I are long time collaborators, friends, and we just decided to come on and talk to you a bit about Dave's expertise. So Dave, you're what I consider a significant expert in Agile for government. So can you share a bit about your background and what led you to specialize in government?
Yeah, absolutely, Ernesto. So I actually started my career in the private sector. So late 80s, I worked in private sector. I did a lot of software development. Mid 90s, I joined one of the big five at the time. It was Big Five accounting and consulting firms. And we did a lot of really large programs. Some of those were for the government, some of them were for private clients. But one of the things that I noticed is, regardless of who the clients were, we often were a lot less successful than I expected us to be, considering we were, one of the top consulting firms in the world. The programs always seemed to struggle, right? And it was the same things. If you looked at lessons learned after each of the programs, you'd hear a lot of the same stuff over and over. Well, the requirements weren't clear. The communication wasn't good enough. We didn't maybe have some of the right skills. It would be, the customers weren't available, a litany of things that seem to recur. And, first I thought, well, maybe it's just me. This is just, you can't do it any better, right? And as I went further in my career, I started really looking for solutions. And I know you and I, came to find Agile at the roughly the same time. Before it was called Agile, we had things like rapid application development, JAD sessions, things that were Agile-ish in nature, spiral development. And but in 2003, I read a paper that really changed the course of my career. It was by Ken Schwaber, and it's been a long time. I don't remember exactly what it said, but it was enough to convince me that, as I thought through it, that what we were doing at the big firms was not in the best interest of our clients. And I ended up leaving then, not long after that, in 2004, building my own company. And basically what we do is try to apply those Agile practices now almost exclusively in government, right? I do a lot of really big programs. Sometimes they're up to a few $1 billion, hundreds, even close to 1,000 people involved. And, finding ways to apply those Agile practices, principles, and values to those programs so that we make the best use of government dollars is a lot of what I do now.
Love that. Thank you for sharing that, Dave, especially the personal journey you went on to realize that in the end, it's really about what is best for the customer. And in a lot of cases, that tends to get murky. One of the things we do in Agile is making sure that we have customer centricity always. So that must have been one of the things you came across and an eye opener.
Yeah, 100%. I'll give you a very specific example, Ernesto. And again, this was not specific to government, but I found it was generally a little even more pronounced in government. The belief of the phase gates, right? That we'd start with requirements and we could know everything up front, so much so that we got sign off, right? And most of us who did that for a while realized, there was a requirements creep or requirements growth. I think some people like Capers Jones may have even put percentages on it. You could expect 3 to 4% of requirements growth every month over the length of the program until you deliver, which is those percentages add up fast. So, if it was 6 or 12 or 18 months before you deliver, you might have 40 or 50% changes in requirements. So anyway, that was one of the things I started realizing how much speed played a role. They'll have to have quality. But the fact that these phase gates sometimes were causing more issues than they fixed. And people feel great about them. It gives you the illusion of control. We get to sign off, and we're only going to deliver what's signed off. But the reality was often very different.
Yeah, this idea that we tend to manage what gets started, not necessarily what gets done.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Love that. That's a good segue into something that I think is also interesting for folks, right? For some folks that might not have experience with government agility, or how agile is government, right? That might have been back in the day, and today they're probably a lot more agile than we think we are. So what are some of the current issues? What are you seeing when it comes to some of the pressing, but also the wins that we're seeing within government agility?
Yeah. And Ernesto, I think we're going to talk about the military a little later, but I do want to use a military example because I want to give two aspects of this. One is, we have some work with the Army, and, my understanding, we're not in the field, right? But the teams are of people out in the field who are defending the nation are extremely agile. They take what's called commander's intent. And so their leadership says, look, here's what we're trying to achieve in the field. We're going to put you out there. You can have a plan, right? But at the end of the day, on the ground, you don't have time to call back to home base and say, hey, we got this going on. And, we thought it might look like this, but it doesn't. It looks a little different. So we're wondering if you can tell us what to do, right? And you can imagine that happening in a firefight. It's not going to happen. These folks need to understand the intent, the objective. And I think my understanding is they do that very well in the field. And we're starting in the military, and I think other places in government as well, at least for our programs, to apply that same ideal to what we do with software development, agility in software. So again, you can apply Agile a lot of different places. We primarily apply it in the context of really big system implementations and replatforms. And there, we're getting a little better. We're not, I think, where they are out in the field, but we're getting better about setting objectives and key results, specific metrics out there to help drive what we're doing. So no longer is it, you're going to implement this software and I need to have it done by this date. It's, here's our goals. And there's probably 10 or 20 ways you can meet those goals. So folks, look, we want to use this type of a platform, but if you can meet our goals in slightly different ways than we conceived, or frankly, in better ways, we're going to turn you loose. And I think that's a very, very different mindset from what we've had in the past in large government implementations and private sector as well. That's something else we should talk about. The government often, it's amazing. They think they're very different and they really look up to the private sector. And don't get me wrong, some private sector firms are, worth looking up to. You and I have worked at others, though, where, look, they've got the same challenges as the government. They think they're different. They've got ingrained cultures. They've been around for 150 years, right? Those types of things play in the private sector as well.
I never thought about it that way. That's really an interesting thought. I got to let that simmer a little bit, because I often think of government as playing catch up. How do they become what a private company is and still service us, the people? But if you think of government as the largest corporation of them all,
right,
with all of the challenges that come with scaling, and you think of the fact that their value is not currency related, but is multidimensional, there's quite a lot. And maybe they're potentially doing better than a large organization would if it were that size, right?
Yeah, we talk about, one of the things that we teach and stress is, where the question comes up, let me put it this way, the question comes up, is government really different? You and I have talked about this at length. We've done some training on it together. And we end up with, some people would say not at all. I would say it is a little bit different. And you brought up one of the reasons. One of the reasons is just scale. When we look at the scale of government, it is beyond. When you look at state and local, you're talking about $3 trillion a year. And then federal, if you just look at the contracts they award, forgetting about the government employees and all those salaries, you're looking at, I think it's like $800 billion a year. I'm not aware of any private sector organization working at that scale. So, and we are accountable to the public, right? Private sector organizations, look, is there some oversight? Absolutely. Are there some laws? It's different with the government. We have what we call, it happens with private sector too, but it's more pronounced for us, is the Washington Post test. Something happens, it gets on the front page of the Washington Post, and that can be game changing. Again, I think it can happen with companies as well, but we are held to a different standard, and our leaders understand that. So we take the time to be a little bit more cautious, as I think any private sector organization would be, with an impact that is broad as what we have.
Yeah, that's a very interesting. Like I said, I think we could peel that back for quite a while and get some really interesting conversations going around that. Now, segueing into the military, because you mentioned that being one of the areas and one of the primary focus of us getting together, because I think it's very interesting to learn how our military is using some of these practices that we often talk about and how they are really, really vested in becoming more and more agile. And you mentioned a couple of things that brought some thoughts to light, right? I think I heard a little bit of McChrystal in there, that team of team formation where individuals on the field are now empowered to make decisions that are intent driven. I thought I heard maybe a little Dave Marquet with the Santa Fe and turn this ship around. And that is a nuclear submarine being led by intent, where you could find agility in the least likely of places. And that might be translating into other areas now based on what I might have heard you say. Right?
Two of my favorite books, of course, Ernesto. And part of what I love, let me take the McChrystal book first. Part of what's great about his book, Team of Teams, is it ended up coming to very similar conclusions about how to operate effectively in a military setting, right? Unrelated to software, as we came to as Agilists. Through you and I both have Dr. Sutherland as a mentor, Scrum Inc. And some of the ways that they found we need to operate in teams of teams so that we could work effectively were very, very similar. So General McChrystal talked about, he was in Iraq, he comes over, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who was had almost no funding compared to, when you compare them to the U.S. military, was, in his words, I won't use his word, but largely kicking our butts, right? They were more nimble. By the time we got intelligence, it was outdated. The slowness of the U.S. military was becoming a huge impediment. And what he did, and we now do in scaled Scrum and scaled agility, is look at how do we synchronize efficiently and effectively every single day to make sure we're on the same page, and how do we empower the teams out there to take that knowledge and to work through that commander's intent. And now, his book was about teams in the field, combat teams, right? And making them more effective. We're just starting, I feel, to apply some of those same techniques to large government programs outside of combat. And by outside of combat, I just mean where we're implementing huge software solutions. So one of the ones we're working on right now, it's multi-billion dollars. I'm not sure how many billions yet. Let's say it's going to be $4 billion over the course of 10 years. Huge, right? And when it's done, it's going to be fantastic. But you and I both know, and the government's not great at this. They don't think small, right? How do you think small when you're doing a $4 billion program? So one of our challenges is to break things down just like they break down those combat teams. They don't have combat teams, right? Or they look at a brigade or something, but the individual teams are small. They're designed to support each other, and small by design. When we do software development, a more agile way to do software development, we try to form small teams. So we need to form small teams, but we also then need to break down that $4 billion program into bite-sized chunks that we can deliver quickly and get feedback on. And that is still, just like it is with many private sector organizations, that's still a new concept. People still struggle with, how do we do that? How do we actually deliver value, Ernesto, within the course of a month, or after we get started, within every few weeks? How do we do that with a big, in this case, a big enterprise resource planning system? That's a challenge.
Yeah, one of the actual lessons that we have in some of the classes that we are engaged with government today is think small, right? All along, you've been told all your life, the secret to success is thinking big. We're trying to coach people around thinking small, right? That's where the trick lies. Love that. And it being, so you mentioned the U.S. Army, USDA. What are some other organizations that are in your wheelhouse today that we know are active in adopting Agile?
Yeah, one of my favorite things is some of the clients we serve. The Army is great, very exciting mission. Department of Veterans Affairs as well. They've got similar challenges. They are, for the civilian agencies, the non-military, they are by far the biggest. So they've got very similar challenges, and obviously their mission is fantastic. But also some more, we talk about them emulating private sector organizations. There's a U.S. Patent and Trademark Office as well. And some people don't know this. They are not appropriate. They're all fee funded. So they fund themselves through the money that they make through the patent applications and management. So that's an example of an organization that is operating more like the private sector. And they actually are a little bit more advanced in some ways. They are actually doing some form of product management, which is still another newer concept in the government. And for those of the people listening who don't know, I'll oversimplify, but product management is about the belief that your products, especially software products, they never end. So in the government, we're typically, and this gets into what we call the color of money as well, we typically distinguish between development projects, and they, in theory, end at a time, and you get development money, and then operations and maintenance, or O&M. So at a certain point in time, somebody arbitrarily makes a decision, you are now in full production, and it's a clean cutoff, right? And now the money that you spend comes is a different color. It comes from a different part of the organization, usually. Now, that might have worked when we did these big bang implementations, right, for software. You could say, hey, here's a project, and we're going to go live on August 1st of 2026. It's in production, and from there, everything after that is support and is O&M, right? But think about that now. Right? We're trying to deliver things in really small increments. So when does O&M start? This is where we talk about policies and regulations and how Congress operates, getting in the way now of how we want to do software development. People don't think about that frequently. And again, I would say this is another difference between private sector organizations and most government entities that are not self-funded. Congress is set up, right? These budgets are set up to distinguish between these two types of money. And now, well, if I deliver something in 3 months, but I've got literally 5 years worth of fairly significant enhancements to do, are we in new development? Are we in O&M? And some people say, well, you got to report out, and you're going to split it. So how do you report it out? Again, maybe some extra administration there.
Yeah, so you're touching on some elements that I think are critical for folks to hear if they're interested in getting involved with government, right? First, that the language varies a little, right? The vocabulary itself, the terms. In what you were describing, I heard a little of OPEX and CAPEX, but maybe in a different term, right? And how that flows through the planning and acquisition. So let's talk a little bit about agile acquisition, meaning how are these recs, how are these roles filled in government today?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up acquisitions, Ernesto, because I was actually talking to somebody at another huge consulting firm probably last week, and we agreed that acquisitions as an enabler of agility is probably the most overlooked concept that we have. We make progress in small segments, right? Thinking with small teams, backlog, decomposition. Very few organizations in government have changed how they acquire services. And I'm going to tell you why, again, with the whole think big mindset, why this is such a huge issue. So I'm going to go back to, well, let's just say a very, very large government client. Okay. And they're going to do, let's say they're going to do a $5 billion program, and it's going to last 10 years. Now, if you and I were looking at that from a private sector organization, we would think about how do we break this down into smaller components, right? The government has some regulations, something called the Federal Acquisition Regulations, or FAR, or in defense, it's the DFAR, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations. And because the way we approach acquisitions today in government in the past has been so onerous, it often takes 18, 24 months to go through a large procurement cycle for something this big. Very common, sometimes longer. So and you can think about what we talked about earlier with requirements creep. So what just happened in the 18 to 24 months that we started this procurement? By the time we're ready to be done, the requirements have probably changed. And, just a little secret I think we learned in the Agile industry long ago, requirements written on paper don't mean a whole lot to a vendor who's reading them and trying to interpret them. They kind of get it, right? Some are very straightforward, but many others, you need to discuss them. So the government spent sometimes years putting these requirements down in 500-page documents, literally, hand them over to vendors and say, hey, vendors, go read these 500 pages of requirements, okay? And here's what we want you to do. Then we want you to write, now we're not going to talk to you, okay? That would be bad because we might talk to you and not say exactly the same thing to somebody else. So basically, we're going to hand paper over the wall for this whole procurement process. Okay, there might be some discussions at the end once we're down to like one or two vendors, mostly about price, right? But for most of the process, we don't talk to you. And probably for the most important parts of the process, which is understanding the actual requirements, they don't talk to us. So we can already see an issue of throwing things over the wall. Written information does not equal understanding. And then it took so long, by the time they get in, the vendor, and they bid on something based on something they completely didn't understand. But really, they come back to their own experience. Say, well, they got all these things, but we can't really do an estimate based on 500 pages of requirements. So we're going to look at them a little bit, and we're going to give them a best estimate and put a lot of assumptions around it. Then what happens? Somebody wins, and for many of the firms, they will issue change orders. So the real work happens once they start and figure out, well, this isn't exactly what we thought it meant. And government, how would we know? Because I can see what's written here. Well, we thought it meant this, and you guys thought it meant that. So now the change orders come, and it's $1 million here, 5 million there, 10 million there. And now you can see how those government programs that said they had a starting budget of, let's say it's 500 million, turn into $1 billion or $1.5 billion or even more. Part of it is the whole acquisition process. If we used a different process, more agile acquisitions, we could potentially shut down a bunch of these misunderstandings in the requirements and jointly come up with better price, more realistically priced solutions. That's a very new concept in government. And again, as much as government is huge, the overhead and administration in the way they contract today makes them think they don't want to do small contracts. They certainly don't want to do a 1 or 2 year contract, right? It takes 2 years just to get it out there. So you end up with 5 year, 10 year. And what happens is then the incumbent has a huge advantage, because if the government switch, there's going to be a tremendous cost of knowledge lost. And oftentimes nothing is delivered for months or years. So it's not even like you and I go in, Ernesto, and we coach some clients. We're going to implement some stuff in production, hopefully in, let's say, a really long period, might be 3 months, right? At least something. These folks, again, they're still, they're trying, but they're still very big bang oriented. So it could be that some of these contractors, literally after years, have delivered nothing. And it just reminded me of a statistic that we teach. This was from an organization called Kessel Run in the Air Force. And I think their finding was, for these large programs in government, the average time to get to production, average, was 4 years.
Wow.
Crazy, right? And that meant some of these programs were a lot longer, 6 or 8 years, right? Now, there may have been a lot of hardware involved in some of those, but some of these pure software programs, that's not crazy.
Yeah, that by definition is just being behind the times, right? By the time you start, it's already over. The technology itself is changing. Your requisition is no longer relevant.
Absolutely.
And that leads into this question of, well, how do folks break into government? For people that are interested in a career in public service or servicing government, you cut your teeth in that industry. You pretty much live around the corner from the White House and can knock on folks' doors. How does that work for individuals that are new to this and want to be a part of it? What words of wisdom do you have for folks out there?
Yeah. First, I'd say, if you're an Agilist or an aspiring Agilist or software developer, or somebody interested in helping their government, there isn't a higher calling. And this is a phenomenal time, if you're any of those things, to get involved, because the US government is on the cusp of making these major changes. They have bought in for much of what we've just talked about. All right, the acquisitions maybe a little less so. Almost everything else, though, they are, there are various stages of capability, but many of them are extremely interested in implementing these agile concepts. So this is a phenomenal time. I encourage everybody, especially experienced coaches, to jump in. It's always great. The coaches that we work with, Ernesto, one of the things that sometimes they're surprised by and love is how much the clients listen. And we do find some who are fantastic listeners and will help you get started. Beyond that, I'd say, the path, at least for what we do, is just to build your skills, whether you're a software engineer, business analyst, let's say you do testing for a living, even project management, or you're involved in the Agile space. There are 2 main ways to get in. One is directly to the government itself. USA Jobs, they post a lot of things there. If you want to be a government employee, certainly one path, and there are some advantages to that. Or you can take the route that I took and Ernesto took, and many of the people we work with, is to be a government contractor, or sometimes now vendor partner, right? More politically correct. And we look at being the experts that the government relies on when they don't have the in-house expertise. In some cases, they specialize, right? They don't necessarily want to have their own scrum masters, their own coaches. They would prefer to have that provided by private sector entities. Not always, but in a lot of places. They've just found they really want to focus on their core mission. Ernesto, you talked about this before. It's not for profit, right? We focus a lot on, are we achieving the mission? And the government has made some, I think, very smart choices about them focusing on policy and those types of things, and allowing the private sector to do what it does best and provide expertise. So think about joining one of the big government contractors. I won't name any specifically, but you can search online for who are the big government contractors. And in doing that work, joining those companies is another great way to take whatever skills you have and add value on these great large government programs.
Or even remaining in the private sector by servicing the public sector. For example, Packaged Agile, that's your company, Dave, Agile Genesis. We engage with government serving contracts, and our people get the opportunity to work on those projects. So I would add that. And also, two quick thoughts came to mind as you were saying that, Dave. The acquisition, we certainly get that. You and I talk about it quite a bit. But I also think it's important to highlight that it comes from a good place. It's not because these people aren't smart. It's not because the solutions are easy and they haven't put them in place. Much of the challenge is to try to give equal access to everyone for these contracts. And to make that a fair bidding process, it has a long workflow about it, right?
Absolutely. So there's no question. There's both these policies, regulations in place that were put there for a good reason. Interestingly, though, one of the things that people end up learning when we teach on Agile acquisitions are the existing regulations provide a whole lot of flexibility that people don't realize. It's those things like you always drove to the beach the exact same way, right? This is just the way we go. And then you figure out, well, when I look at the map, when I really look at it, there's some options here that in some cases, depending on when I'm leaving, are going to be a lot faster, a lot more effective for me, right? The 8A route, we won't get too detailed in different things, but you're working on your an 8A certification, Ernesto, with Agile Genesis. We've got a hub zone certification at Packaged Agile. There are ways to get around some of those long procurement cycles, especially for smaller acquisitions, not even so small, but especially for the smaller ones to aid small business. So that was also built into the process that, frankly, it's something I hope they never do away with, right? And they do want to sponsor small businesses. So that's part of the reason the regs are there.
Yeah. And we're almost a little bit out of time. I've been representing some of the questions that have been coming in, and I left a juicy one for last. People are interested in knowing what frameworks the government might be using. How much SAFe, how much of Scrum at Scale, perhaps. I know I'm starting to notice a shift in the flexibility of frameworks, but very curious to hear your thoughts and insights on that.
Yeah. Well, let me take the team level first. I'd say by far, just like we see in the private sector and private companies, Scrum as a team level framework is still by far the most popular. And you and I teach on some of the metrics, but the general rule of thumb, I say in the government, maybe even more so than private sectors, if somebody says they're, quote, doing Agile, 4 out of 5 of them, 80%, are probably doing Scrum or some form of Scrum. Scrum Bond, Scrum and XP, things like that. So at a team level, Scrum's got it, right? Just like everywhere else. Now, at a scaled level, when you start talking about how do we get teams of teams working together for these really big programs that I mentioned that I'm often a part of, and the Scaled Agile Framework, or SAFe, I would say is still the most popular option in government. And people will talk about different things with SAFe. Is it great? Is it bad? Look, I'll say for an experienced coach, you can take the pieces that you really need and apply them effectively. right? If you view it just as a framework, it's not as a list of must-haves, but hey, here are some practices that often work that you can take, and you can. A key is you guess what? You change them over time. You learn, you figure out what works well and what doesn't. But you can lay things on as well. So the Scrum Inc. actually or Scrum at Scale published a case study that I did 5 years ago. Almost had to rewatch it to remember what I said. But it was applying some Scrum at Scale techniques to really a waterfall program, and how just a few of those techniques in that case were transformative, right? So I feel like we don't generally propose a specific brand of scaled agile. We will say, look, let's come in. If you already have something, let's take a simple framework like Scrum at Scale. You're already probably doing Scrum some places. It's a natural way to move forward. And then if we find practices, obviously DevOps is huge today, or DevSecOps. If we find practices even from from Scaled Agile framework that we think are great, we use them. And if they don't work well, we use them as experiments, try them, and we'll jettison them just as quick as we brought them in.
Yeah, it just occurred to me, Dave. By the way, Matt made a great comment. He said several of the agencies are moving away from SAFe, and it has been an observation, nothing more. I don't have the data behind that, but that more and more departments are open to other frameworks, whereas before there seemed to have been a mandate that required almost individuals to think SAFe if you were in government. I think that's becoming less and less. It's not that SAFe is not being used in government, but now they have the options that before might have not been as open, right?
Yeah.
Well, the challenge is getting mid-managers and leaders to adopt a model that has agile behavior. That's Matt's comment there as well.
100%. It's really about driving the outcome. So one of the things that we had an agency not long ago, we responded to an RFP and they said, look, we're currently using SAFe or something very much like it. They had tailored it. They weren't necessarily feeling like they were getting the results they were looking for. So they did ask, what would you recommend? Is there a framework you'd recommend? But I will tell you still, we respond to a lot of RFPs, requests for proposals from the government. And many of them still do say, we're using SAFe. And you would think you could still suggest that they try something different. Most of the vendor partners would shy away from doing that because they think if they mention it, it's what they want. And a lot of times it is, right? So the key for me is, are we getting the outcomes? And I don't care what framework you use. I think a good set of coaches can help the government get outcomes by starting with a framework called just about anything.
So the first, in full transparency and to mitigate the potential bias, Dave and I are both certified have advanced forms of certification in Scaled Agile framework and also with the Agile Education Program with Scrum at Scale. So we train on both. We are certified, and it occurred to me, Dave, packaged Agile, your company. I know we had this conversation once. It's really about that. It's really about having a toolkit where you're pulling things from wherever it works and creating a package for individuals that fits their need. The genesis in Agile, Genesis is just that. It's about thinking about a new era of agility where we are using what works for individuals rather than being focused on any one framework. Okay?
Yeah, one of the things that we talk about, and I think our customers embrace, especially the ones who are not geeky agilists, is just, I want a result. You can use whatever methods you want to get me to that result. So this is part of our tagline is results delivered. This is what we're trying to do, is make sure they get results. And the challenge with a lot of frameworks, and I'd say this of maturity assessments, things like that as well, Ernesto, is that in some ways they make everything look equal. there's literally 100 things you could be improving. But if I improve this little thing over here, is that going to give me the value that I get from improving this thing over here? Where by knowing what we know, the one over here has what I'd say much higher leverage to improve. And there's always limited time for improvement. People have change fatigue, right? So you can't do it all. And I think that's where, regardless of the framework, knowing what is going to get you the most results for every dollar invested is absolutely essential.
Yeah, and we can go on and on, right? The additional thought is that some folks aren't happy with that improvement. When we talk about a marginal improvement, we're still talking about a 50% in some cases,
Yeah.
whether you're measuring engagement or whether you're measuring value delivery or productivity. These are run with the jackpot type of improvements. You might not be getting hyper productivity, which is 10x on those things, because you're not using the Swiss Army precision that will go with what you need. But there are individuals who are happy with that 50% and where those framework insertions are still tremendously useful. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things I'll mention that we teach on, and there's both government metrics and private sector metrics to back this up, is for really big software programs. The failure rate probably approaches 40%. And by failure rate, I don't mean that it was just late or we delivered a little less capability. I mean some of the examples that we've got where the same software program, I'm thinking at an agency right now where we currently work, the same software program, they tried it once, they spent, I think it was $250 million, shut it down, didn't work. They tried it again 4 years later, spent 90 million, and the estimates went up, but at least they figured out earlier, after only 90 million, they didn't feel they were going in the right direction, so they shut it down. Those are the types of failures, I mean. If we could do nothing but cut those down 40%, you talk about not being perfect. We don't need to be perfect. What we need to do is at least start with breaking things down so that we can make smaller failures, more frequent learning, some people prefer. But we don't have to be perfect. That's part of what's amazing here, is how low-hanging some of the fruit really is.
And that brings us to, I think, a very key takeaway in this conversation as we wrap up. We're talking real money and value delivered to people, citizens like you and I or anyone else. By helping and getting better, government is actually saving tax dollars and improving the quality of life of the people. And that's a tremendous purpose, which gets me motivated and optimistic.
Me as well, Ernesto. I joke. A friend of mine worked at did Agile for a large fast food chain, and brilliant guy. I love him, great Agilist. But I talked about, for me, what gets me up in the morning, and it wasn't making a better chicken sandwich. I love the fact, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? But for me,
everybody loves a chicken sandwich.
I actually, yes, this chain, I love their chicken sandwiches. I actually have my wife Raquel picked one up, and it's downstairs waiting for me. So don't get me wrong, but the mission is undeniable. We say if we at that large agency we just talked about, they're redoing some of the programs that failed twice. The third time they've actually done some implementations now, right? Not perfect, but there are real implementations and people really using the software. The money from not failing again goes to veterans. It goes to their health care. It goes to better prosthetics so they can live better lives. This is real stuff, right? If you talked earlier about people getting engaged in the government. This is part of what excites me, is that we have the opportunity to provide more money for those things. And the dollars, as you said, it's not small amounts of money. It is tens of billions of dollars, even if we're not perfect.
Love that. Dave, thank you. And we're going to get the chance to do that tomorrow. So tomorrow you and I start on the AM, and we're working with some great folks in government, and really looking forward to that. And then again next week with a different organization, different team. Even the value stream, which is a tremendous tool for folks to improve. So I think this has a part two to it that we might put on the shelf and come back after we've got our observations and learn lessons from interacting with these folks that we're working with now. Thank you so much, Dave.
My pleasure, Ernesto. Looking forward to part two.
Be well.